Before the story starts, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
When HOA cops tried to kidnap my son, I'm a U.S. Marshals Chief. The sun was setting over Maplewood Estates, a small suburban neighborhood in the middle of nowhere, or at least that's what everyone believed. The streets were clean, lawns neatly trimmed, and neighbors always waved at each other in passing. To anyone driving through, it looked like a perfect place to live. But for one family, the calm was only skin deep. Chief Mark Reynolds had just returned from a long day at work. As a U.S. Marshal Chief, he was used to danger, to facing criminals who would not think twice before hurting someone. But he never thought that danger would walk up to his own front door disguised as the local Homeowners Association officers. Mark parked his black SUV in the driveway, his young son, Danny, running up to greet him. "Dad! Did you bring my comic book?" Danny asked, eyes shining with excitement. Mark smiled, ruffling his son's hair. He always tried to keep life simple at home. Maplewood was supposed to be a quiet escape from the chaos of his job. But something felt off that evening. From the corner of his eye, Mark noticed a car parked across the street. It wasn't unusual to see neighbors' cars, but this one seemed different. Two men in plain, dark uniforms were sitting inside, talking in low voices. Their eyes occasionally flicked toward Mark's house, and the way they stared gave him a strange feeling. It was like they were waiting for something. He tried to ignore it. Maybe it's just a neighbor visiting, he thought. But his gut told him otherwise. He had learned over the years that gut feelings were rarely wrong. As Mark stepped into the house, he noticed the lights flicker for a brief second. The wind outside picked up suddenly, rattling the windows. Danny was busy showing his latest drawing to his dad, completely unaware of the strange tension outside. But Mark could not shake the feeling that the evening would not stay calm for long. Around the same time, a soft knock echoed on the front door. Mark froze for a moment. He rarely had visitors at this hour. He walked slowly toward the door, keeping a careful eye out the window. "Hello, Mr. Reynolds," said a man in a crisp uniform, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "We are with the HOA, sir. We need to speak with you about a complaint." Mark's heart rate quickened slightly, though he remained calm. "A complaint?" he asked, opening the door just enough to speak through. "About what?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he handed a small envelope. "Please review this, sir. It's very important." Mark took it and noticed the paper inside was official-looking. It mentioned violations that seemed minor: grass height, fence alignment, and a few other things that seemed trivial. But something about the way the men were standing there, too rigid and too serious, made him uneasy. He smiled politely. "Thank you, I'll take a look." The two men lingered outside for a moment longer, then walked back to their car. Mark watched them leave, feeling a knot in his stomach. He had seen many kinds of threats before, but something about this situation was different. These were not ordinary people. Danny tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, who are they?" Mark crouched down to his son's level. "Just some neighbors, buddy. Nothing to worry about." But deep inside, he knew that wasn't true. Later that night, Mark tried to relax. He read a bedtime story to Danny, kissed him goodnight, and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. But sleep did not come easily. His training had taught him to notice the small details, the things that others might ignore. And those details screamed that something dangerous was approaching. Around midnight, a sound outside made Mark sit up straight. It was faint, almost like the rustle of footsteps on the gravel driveway. He grabbed his phone and quietly peeked through the curtains. The same dark car was there again. This time, two men were outside, scanning the yard. Their faces were partly hidden under caps, but their eyes were visible. Cold. Intent. Focused. Mark's pulse quickened. He had faced criminals who would kill without hesitation, but these men were unusual. They were organized, calm, and strangely confident, like they believed no one would notice them. He watched them for several minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they got back into their car and drove away. Mark exhaled slowly, trying to calm himself, but his mind was racing. Why would HOA officers act like this? Why now? The next morning, Mark tried to go about his routine. He took Danny to school, drove to the local store, and greeted neighbors. But the memory of the previous night lingered. When he returned home, he found a note slipped under the front door. His hands were steady as he picked it up, but his eyes narrowed as he read it. It was short. One sentence. We are watching. Don't try to interfere. Mark's jaw tightened. Whoever wrote this knew exactly who he was. And they thought they could intimidate him. He called a trusted colleague from the marshal's office and explained the situation in vague terms. This is strange, Mark said. These people aren't ordinary HOA officers. Something about this feels dangerous. His colleague agreed. Stay alert. Trust your instincts. If you feel threatened, don't hesitate to act. We can't underestimate anyone who comes into your home with a hidden agenda. Mark hung up and looked at Danny, who was playing in the backyard, oblivious to the tension. He felt a surge of protectiveness. Nothing would happen to his son, not if he could stop it. As evening approached again, Mark's sense of unease grew. The shadows around the house seemed darker. Every sound of the creak of the gate, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified. He moved through the house with precision, checking locks, windows, and doors. He even placed a camera at the front gate, watching the live feed on his phone. And then, just as he was about to sit down, the feed showed movement. The same car, the same men. They were back. They were not leaving. And this time, they were looking directly at the house, as if waiting for something or someone. Mark's mind raced. He had faced many dangers in his career, but never so close to home. He had trained to protect others, to act under pressure, and to anticipate threats. But this was personal. And in that moment, he realized that his life, and more importantly, his son's life, was about to change forever. Because what started as a small HOA complaint was about to become the most dangerous situation of his life. And the scary truth was, the enemy was already inside the neighborhood, watching, planning, and waiting for the perfect moment. The morning sun barely touched the edges of Maplewood Estates when Chief Mark Reynolds stepped out of his house. He needed air, clarity. Last night's events replayed in his mind: the dark car, the men in uniforms, the threatening note. Something about it didn't make sense. HOA officers didn't behave like criminals. But these men were different. As he walked toward the mailbox, Mark noticed the quiet was almost too quiet. Usually, kids played outside, dogs barked, and neighbors mowed lawns. Today, there was only the faint hum of a distant lawnmower. Even the birds seemed still. Mark felt the familiar pull in his chest, the instinct that told him something was lurking. He paused mid-step, eyes scanning the street. Across the road, the same black car from last night sat parked, engine off. He couldn't see the men clearly, but he could feel their gaze. It was not casual. It was calculated. Mark turned and went back inside, careful not to alert anyone. He checked the camera feed he had set up outside. The men were moving slowly around his property, as if counting steps, noting every detail. His mind worked fast. Why would HOA officers act like this? He remembered reading something similar during a past investigation: criminals disguised as officials to intimidate someone. But could this really happen here, in his quiet neighborhood? He decided to test them. Mark stepped back outside, deliberately carrying a cup of coffee, pretending to be relaxed. He waved casually at the street. The men froze, glanced toward him, then quickly turned away. Their movements were sharp, deliberate, too careful. Mark narrowed his eyes. They were not amateurs. They had experience, military or law enforcement training. But why here? Why target him? Danny appeared at the door, rubbing his eyes. "Dad, why are those men looking at us again?" Mark crouched down. "Just some neighbors, buddy. Don't worry. Go inside and finish your breakfast." Danny hesitated, staring at the men, then turned reluctantly. Mark followed him inside, silently planning his next steps. After breakfast, Mark decided to take a walk around the block alone. If they were watching, he needed to see how far they were willing to go. As he walked, he noticed subtle signs, footprints in the dirt near his garden, a small branch broken in the yard across the street, a shadow moving behind a tree. Then it happened. He saw one of the men approach the mailbox, looking around like he expected someone to appear. Mark stayed calm, pretending to check his phone. But inside, every muscle was tense. His instincts screamed danger. Suddenly, the man looked straight at him, and for a second, Mark saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, as if the man knew exactly who he was. But why? How? Mark continued walking, keeping his phone in hand. He noticed that they weren't following him openly. They were trying to stay hidden, blending in, observing his patterns. That's when he realized, they weren't here just to intimidate. They were planning something bigger. Returning home, Mark decided to confront them indirectly. He sent a quick text to a trusted friend in law enforcement, possible threat at home. 2 men, unusual behavior. Keep watch. Minutes later, the black car moved again. This time, the men drove slowly past the house, then stopped at the corner. One of them got out, pretending to jog but clearly scanning the property. Mark watched from the window, noting every detail, the way the man's shoes scuffed on the gravel, the way his eyes scanned the yard, the way his hands twitched near his pockets. Mark's mind raced. This is not a normal HOA complaint. They are trained. They are organized. And they are watching my son. The hours passed, each minute stretching like hours. Mark tried to stay calm, trying to act like an ordinary homeowner, but he knew he was being tested. Whoever they were, they wanted a reaction, a mistake. And Mark had no intention of giving them one. Late in the afternoon, Mark decided to step outside again, but this time, he took a small, hidden recording device with him. He moved casually toward the street, pretending to water a plant, all the while capturing the movements of the men. They noticed him immediately. One of them raised his hand in a wave, but it was stiff, unnatural, a mockery of friendliness. Mark smiled politely, hiding his growing suspicion. He knew he was gathering evidence now. They wouldn't see the next move coming. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the men dropped a small envelope on the street near Mark's mailbox and left quickly. Mark picked it up cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words written in bold, threatening letters. Stay out. Mark's heart didn't race, he was trained for fear, but he felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. They had crossed a line. Someone was testing him, warning him, trying to see if he would back down. Mark clenched his fist. He glanced at the driveway. Danny was inside, playing with his toys, oblivious to the danger lurking just outside. That's when it hit him, this was no ordinary confrontation. This was personal. And it was just the beginning. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows stretched across the street. Mark stood silently by the mailbox, watching the black car that had returned once more, engine idling. He knew one thing for certain, the next encounter would not be just words. The strange men outside weren't leaving. And Mark Reynolds, Chief U.S. Marshal, would need all his skills to protect his family and uncover the truth behind this mysterious threat. For the first time in years, Mark felt the thrill of the chase, not as a marshal in the field, but on his own doorstep, where the enemy might already be closer than he imagined. The night fell like a heavy curtain over Maplewood Estates. Streetlights flickered, casting long, strange shadows across the quiet roads. Inside the Reynolds home, Danny slept peacefully, unaware that the darkness outside hid men who had no intention of leaving. Mark Reynolds sat in his living room, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the live camera feed. The black car was back. Not just parked this time, it moved slowly along the street, stopping briefly in front of neighboring houses as if checking each property. Mark's instincts screamed, they are not just watching. They are planning. The envelope from the morning still lay on the table, stay out. Simple words, but heavy with threat. Mark had seen messages like this before in his line of work, and he knew one thing, people who leave warnings like this are not bluffing. He walked silently to Danny's room, making sure the boy was asleep. The soft rise and fall of Danny's chest made Mark's chest tighten. They want to scare me, he thought, but they don't know who they are dealing with. Suddenly, a soft beep from the camera made him freeze. The black car had stopped closer, right outside the Reynolds driveway. Two men stepped out, their faces partially hidden under low caps. One of them held a small device, a motion sensor, maybe, or a camera. They moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the yard. Mark's mind raced. This is no longer intimidation. They are marking my house, studying it, learning it. He quietly opened the drawer and pulled out a compact firearm. Not to use immediately, but just in case. Every precaution mattered. The men disappeared from the camera's view. Mark wondered if they had entered the yard. He could hear faint footsteps, almost silent outside. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Then a sudden loud noise came from the front gate. It clicked open. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Someone was trying to enter. He rushed to the door, peering through the peephole. Nobody. Just the empty street. But the gate had moved. He knew someone had been there. Mark realized the threat had escalated faster than he expected. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was about control. They were testing him, pushing boundaries to see how he would react. The next morning brought no relief. Mark found more evidence that someone had been inside the yard during the night: footprints near the garage, scuff marks on the driveway, and tiny scratches on his son's bicycle. Whoever had done this had planned it carefully. They wanted him to notice, to feel fear, but they hadn't touched Danny yet. That made Mark furious. He decided to confront the situation differently. Using his experience as a U.S. Marshal Chief, he began documenting everything: footprints, tire marks, broken branches, the positions of cameras. Every detail mattered. Then came the first direct message. This time, not just a note under the door. A small, black envelope appeared in Danny's mailbox. Mark carefully opened it. Inside. Your son is next. The words were simple. The threat was clear. Mark's eyes narrowed. This is personal. They know he's my weakness. They are testing me, pushing me to make a mistake. Mark didn't panic. Fear was not new to him. But anger mixed with determination burned in his chest. He decided that night would not pass quietly. He set up cameras in every corner, hid motion sensors, and even rigged a few decoys to catch intruders off guard. Every move was calculated. Every shadow watched. Hours later, around midnight, Mark heard the faint sound of a car stopping outside. The black SUV of the intruders, unmistakable. They stayed for a long time, waiting, watching. Mark stayed still in his living room, listening to every sound. And then, the sound of something or someone scraping against the side gate. Mark's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. He dialed a trusted law enforcement contact and whispered, "They are here. Not just watching. They are testing me directly. Be ready." Suddenly, a flash of movement outside caught his eye. One of the men was walking toward the backyard, carefully, almost like a cat. Mark grabbed his flashlight and quietly opened the back door. The man froze, caught in the light for just a second. Mark's voice was calm, commanding, "Stop. Now." The man didn't move. Just stared. Mark stepped closer, and the intruder suddenly bolted toward the street. Mark tracked him until he disappeared into the shadows. Mark knew one thing: this was only the beginning. Whoever these men were, they were not leaving. Their actions were no longer subtle. They had escalated their game, they were willing to cross lines, and they knew he couldn't ignore it. He looked at Danny sleeping in his room and made a promise to himself: "I will protect him. No one will touch my son." The strange encounters, the notes, the watching, it had all escalated into a direct threat. And Mark Reynolds, Chief U.S. Marshal, knew one truth: the people outside were dangerous, clever, and relentless. But he was smarter, faster, and ready. Because this wasn't just about following the law anymore. This was personal. And the next encounter would test everything Mark knew: his skills, his patience, and his courage. The night was heavy with silence. Maplewood Estates, usually calm, seemed to hold its breath. Inside the Reynolds house, Danny slept soundly, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Mark Reynolds, Chief U.S. Marshal, moved quietly through the living room, checking cameras, listening to every sound. The black car had returned. Tonight, they weren't just watching. He could feel it. Every instinct screamed that the intruders were ready to act. Mark peeked through the blinds and saw them, the same two men, uniforms barely visible under the dim streetlight. They moved with precision, as if rehearsed. One of them held a small backpack, the kind used to carry tools or restraining equipment. Mark's jaw tightened. This was it. They intended to take Danny. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could remove the tension building in his chest. He quietly whispered to himself, "Not tonight. Not my son." Mark grabbed a small, tactical flashlight and a handgun, keeping his steps silent. He moved to the side door, watching the intruders' every move on the camera feed. One of the men was slowly approaching the front door, testing the locks. Mark's mind raced. "I need a plan. Quick. They are trained, just like me. I can't underestimate them." He slipped outside through the back door, moving like a shadow through the yard. His presence was hidden, but he could see every step of the intruders. The man with the backpack was now near the garage, glancing toward the house as if calculating his entry. Mark's voice, calm but firm, cut through the darkness. "Stop right there." The intruder froze. For a moment, Mark thought they might retreat, but they didn't. The other man moved quickly toward Danny's window, trying to slide it open. Mark acted fast. In one smooth motion, he stepped from the shadows and pointed his flashlight directly at the man. The sudden light blinded the intruder, giving Mark the advantage. "Get back! Or you won't leave!" Mark shouted, his voice steady and commanding. The men hesitated. This wasn't what they expected. They had planned for fear, confusion, and hesitation, but not a trained U.S. Marshal confronting them directly. Mark lunged forward, tackling the man near the window, disarming him in a precise move learned over years of training. The backpack fell to the ground, revealing ropes and a small stun device. The second man realized the situation had changed. He bolted toward the street, but Mark wasn't done. He pursued silently, using the shadows and his knowledge of the terrain. Within moments, he cornered the man near a fence, flashlight in his face. "You picked the wrong house," Mark said, calm but deadly serious. "I'm not just any homeowner. I am a U.S. Marshal. You won't touch my family." The intruder froze, realizing he had underestimated his target. He dropped a small knife he had been holding and raised his hands. Mark didn't celebrate. There was no time. He rushed back inside to check on Danny, who had woken up during the commotion and was now hiding behind the couch, eyes wide with fear. "Dad, they were here?" Danny whispered. Mark crouched down, putting a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes, buddy. But they won't hurt you. I promise. You're safe now." Even as Mark reassured Danny, he knew this was only the beginning. The intruders had tried once, failed, and would likely come again. They weren't amateurs, they were trained, organized, and relentless. Mark called a trusted colleague in the marshal's office. "They came for my son tonight. I stopped them, but they're dangerous. We need to track them, find out who sent them, and stop them before they try again." As he hung up, Mark glanced out the window. The black car was gone, but the shadows lingered, as if watching, waiting. He knew the enemies wouldn't give up easily. Mark sat with Danny until he fell asleep again. He checked every lock, every camera, every entry point in the house. He was prepared, alert, and ready, but the adrenaline still ran high. This night had proven one thing: the HOA officers, or whoever they really were not just bullies. They were a real threat. And Mark Reynolds, U.S. Marshal, was going to make sure they never came near his son again. But deep down, he knew the next move wouldn't be easy. They would escalate. They would plan more carefully. And Mark had to be ready for anything. The dawn was gray and cold, with mist rolling over Maplewood Estates. Inside the Reynolds home, the family tried to sleep, but Mark Reynolds hadn't closed his eyes. The events of last night replayed in his mind: the black car, the men trying to take Danny, the tense chase in the shadows. He had won this round, but he knew the war wasn't over. Mark sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, eyes scanning the street through the window. Every detail mattered: the angles of shadows, the way neighbors' cars were parked, even the placement of the mailboxes. He was a U.S. Marshal Chief, trained to notice everything. But he had kept that part of his life secret from everyone, even the neighbors. Until now. Because today, the intruders would learn who they were really dealing with. Around mid-morning, Mark noticed the familiar black car slowly driving down the street. The men inside scanned the houses, their eyes sharp and calculating. But this time, Mark had a plan that went beyond cameras and tracking. He stepped outside, dressed in casual clothes, pretending to water his lawn. The men didn't recognize him at first. They expected fear, hesitance, weakness. Instead, they saw calm, confidence, and watchfulness. One of the men got out of the car, walking toward Mark as if to intimidate him. Mark stayed still, keeping his hands visible, acting casual. The intruder smirked, thinking he had the upper hand. Then Mark spoke, voice steady but commanding. "You don't know who you're messing with." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The man paused, confused. He expected the homeowner to cower, not to warn him. Mark took a slow step forward, calm but unyielding. "I am not just a resident of this neighborhood. I am a U.S. Marshal Chief. You're standing in front of someone who is trained for situations far worse than you can imagine. And if you come near my family again," his gaze hardened, "you will regret it." The intruders froze, disbelief crossing their faces. One of them whispered to the other, doubt creeping into his voice. Their plan: intimidation, fear, perhaps even kidnapping, was crumbling. They had underestimated the quiet man in a suburban home. Mark continued, his voice low, deliberate. "I've faced armed criminals, fugitives, and gang leaders. You are not a challenge to me. You are a mistake. And mistakes are corrected quickly." The intruders glanced at each other, panic now replacing arrogance. They had counted on fear to control the situation, but Mark's calm authority turned the tables instantly. Mark stepped closer, watching their every micro-movement. His instincts told him they were trained enough to be dangerous, but not enough to outsmart a U.S. Marshal who was fully aware of their intentions. "You've tested my patience," he said. "You've threatened my son. But now you've learned who I am. And this is your only warning." The man holding the backpack slowly raised his hands. The other stumbled backward toward the car, unsure whether to run or retreat. Mark's calm dominance was disorienting. They realized the man they thought was an ordinary homeowner was someone who could end their plans in an instant. Mark didn't shout, didn't need to. His presence, his authority, and the quiet power in his voice were enough. The black car started slowly, and within moments, it was gone, leaving the street eerily quiet again. Mark watched them disappear, but he knew this wasn't the end. They had learned his identity, yes, but it was a dangerous revelation. Now they would plan differently, perhaps more carefully. But they would never underestimate him again. Turning back to his house, Mark saw Danny playing in the front yard, unaware of the tension that had just unfolded. Mark smiled faintly, feeling both relief and resolve. His family was safe for now, but the lesson was clear: secrets could protect you, but truth, when revealed at the right moment, could become your greatest weapon. Mark knew that from this day forward, Maplewood Estates would never be ordinary again for him, or for anyone who tried to threaten his family. Because he was not just a father. He was a U.S. Marshal Chief. And anyone foolish enough to cross him would learn that the hard way. The night had fallen again over Maplewood Estates, but this time, Mark Reynolds felt different. Calm, focused, and ready. The previous encounters had taught him exactly how these intruders thought. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was planning. Mark reviewed the footage from the hidden cameras, noting every detail, their movements, timing, patterns. The black car, the backpacks, the way they observed his house, it was all predictable. And predictability was weakness. He set up decoys around the property, cameras in fake positions, motion sensors hidden behind trees, and a few small lights to create false shadows. Every move was calculated to make the intruders think they had the upper hand. Mark also prepared himself physically. He rehearsed entry points, escape routes, and how to intercept the men without putting Danny at risk. Every action had a purpose. By midnight, the black car appeared again, silently rolling down the street. Mark watched from the shadows, eyes narrowed. The men had clearly learned he was a U.S. Marshal Chief, but Mark had one advantage: knowledge. He knew their overconfidence would lead them to underestimate even the smallest detail. The first man stepped out of the car, backpack slung over his shoulder. He moved cautiously toward the side of the house, unaware that a motion sensor quietly triggered a small alert. Mark activated a faint light in the yard, enough to cast a shadow on the man's position. The intruder froze. He didn't know if he had been spotted. And that was exactly what Mark wanted. Mark slipped out from the shadows silently, keeping the intruder in view. He moved behind the man with careful precision and used a small rope trap near the fence, a technique he had learned in tactical training, to subtly snag the man's leg. The intruder stumbled, startled, barely catching himself. Mark stepped into the dim light. "Calm, controlled," he said, "it's time to end this game." The man spun around, reaching for something in his backpack, but Mark was faster. With a smooth, practiced motion, he disabled the intruder's device and disarmed him, all without a loud sound. Meanwhile, the second man, who had been watching from the car, tried to intervene. But Mark had anticipated this. From his hidden position, he used a small flashlight to temporarily blind the man, giving him just enough time to corner him near the driveway. "You've made a mistake coming back," Mark said, voice steady, eyes cold. "I don't just protect my family, I neutralize threats." The two intruders looked at each other, now realizing they were completely outmatched. Their confidence had been crushed by the calm precision of a man who was trained for situations far worse than they could imagine. Mark secured the men with ropes he had prepared earlier. Not for punishment, but to prevent any further attempt. He moved quickly, checking the surroundings, making sure no additional threat was nearby. Then, he made a calculated decision. He called a trusted colleague in law enforcement. "I've secured the intruders. They need to be processed and questioned. Prepare for evidence collection. They're organized, but I've cornered them." Mark's colleague responded immediately, ensuring officers would arrive quickly. By the time backup reached the house, the intruders were caught, off balance, and trapped not by brute force, but by intelligence, foresight, and strategic planning. As the officers took the men away, Mark watched, a faint smile forming. This had been more than stopping a threat. It had been a demonstration of strategy, patience, and control. He had turned the game entirely in his favor. Returning to his home, Mark checked on Danny, who had woken up during the commotion but was unharmed. Sitting beside him, Mark whispered, "Everything is okay now. You're safe." But even in that relief, Mark knew one thing: Maplewood Estates had changed. He had shown his enemies that he was not someone to be underestimated. And anyone foolish enough to threaten his family again would meet the same precision and skill. Mark reflected for a moment. He had protected his family. He had outsmarted trained intruders. And he had done it with the calm focus of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. The game had shifted. Now, he controlled every move. And that control was absolute. The morning sun broke over Maplewood Estates, casting warm light across the quiet streets. But for the Reynolds family, the neighborhood felt different now, like a place that had once been safe, and now would always carry the memory of danger. Mark Reynolds sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, watching Danny play in the living room. The black car was gone. The men who had threatened his family were in custody, facing questions and consequences. Yet Mark knew this victory was not just about arrests, it was about control, awareness, and courage. He thought back to the events of the past week, the threatening notes, the black car that appeared like a shadow at night, the intrusion attempts, the failed kidnapping. Each moment had been tense, terrifying, and unpredictable. And each moment had reminded him why he had trained so long, why he had prepared for situations no ordinary person could imagine. Mark looked at Danny, smiling faintly. "You know, kid, sometimes the quietest streets hide the darkest secrets," he said softly. Danny tilted his head, curious, too young to fully understand. Mark continued, voice steady, "But courage always wins. No matter how smart or dangerous someone thinks they are, courage can protect what matters most." Outside, the neighborhood seemed normal again, but Mark knew better. He had learned something important: danger could appear anywhere, even in the most peaceful places. But preparation, patience, and intelligence could outmatch even the most cunning threats. He spent the day repairing small damages, checking locks, and reinforcing security, not because he feared the worst, but because he understood that safety is built, not just hoped for. As evening approached, Mark finally relaxed, sitting with Danny and telling him a story about a hero who protected his village from danger. Danny listened, wide-eyed, imagining the brave hero. Little did he know, his own father had just played that hero in real life. Mark reflected on the intruders and their arrogance. They had underestimated him, his family, and the consequences of crossing a line. And he realized something else: sometimes, showing strength quietly, strategically, and with intelligence is far more powerful than showing force alone. He also thought about the neighbors, unaware of the danger that had lurked so close. For them, life had returned to normal. For Mark, life had changed. He had learned that vigilance was not fear, it was responsibility. And protecting those you love sometimes means facing fear head-on, thinking several steps ahead, and acting decisively when it matters most. Night fell over Maplewood Estates, calm and quiet once more. Mark tucked Danny into bed, kissed him on the forehead, and whispered, "Sleep well, buddy. Daddy's always watching." Standing at the window, Mark looked out over the street. The black car would not return. The intruders had learned a lesson: some houses are not just homes, they are fortresses, and some fathers are not just men, they are guardians trained to defend everything they love. Mark knew that life would continue. Challenges would arise, threats might appear again, but he was ready. Maplewood Estates might seem ordinary to the world, but to Mark Reynolds, it was a place of vigilance, courage, and strength. And in that quiet street, under the watchful eyes of a father who had faced danger head-on, peace finally returned. But not through luck, through courage, preparation, and the unshakable determination to protect family, no matter what. Because sometimes the greatest heroes do not wear uniforms in public. Sometimes, they are fathers who would move heaven and earth to keep their children safe. And for Mark Reynolds, Chief U.S. Marshal, that hero's work was never finished, but tonight, for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel that he had truly won.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it.